Who was Muhammad, and how do we know? I'm Aisha Musa. In this video, we're going to be looking at how to find and use credible secondary sources on the life of Muhammad. The first thing we need to talk about in studying any subject is sources. A source is a person or a document or something that provides information about the subject you're studying. There are three kinds of sources: primary sources, secondary sources, and tertiary sources. Primary sources are usually based on first-hand knowledge. Secondary sources rely on primary sources, and tertiary sources rely on secondary sources. The most common secondary sources about the life of Muhammad are books written by academic scholars of Arabic and Islamic studies, such as Martin Ling's Muhammad, His Life Based on the Earliest Sources, Omid Safi's Memories of Muhammad, Why the Prophet Matters, Anne-Marie Schimmel's Islam an Introduction, and John Esposito's Islam the Straight Path. In addition to books by individual authors, secondary sources also include academic journal articles and edited volumes to which individual authors contribute specific chapters on a topic, such as the Cambridge Companion to Muhammad. Tertiary sources rely on secondary sources and include such things as articles written by journalists and other non-specialists, published in magazines, newspapers, and on blogs. Encyclopedias, such as Wikipedia, are also tertiary sources. In evaluating the credibility of secondary and tertiary sources, you need to ask some key questions about the author. What are their credentials, their areas of expertise? What qualifies them to write on the subject? Have they written anything else on the subject? Is it published with a reputable publisher? What kind of sources do they use? Are they using primary and credible secondary sources? These questions will help you decide just how credible a particular source is. Let's look at a few examples. The first example I want to talk about is Martin Ling's, the author of Muhammad, His Life Based on the Earliest Sources, which many Muslims consider to be the finest English language biography of the Prophet Muhammad. Lings was born in 1909 and died in 2005. He was a British Orientalist and convert to Islam. Lings lived in Cairo for 11 years, where he studied Arabic. After returning to England, he got both a bachelor's and a doctorate in Arabic studies from the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. Lings lectured at a number of universities and was the keeper of Oriental manuscripts at the British Museum and the British Library. Omid Safi is part of a newer generation of Muslim academics. He holds both undergraduate and graduate degrees in religious studies from Duke University. Like Lings before him, Safi's training, background, and expertise allow him to work closely with the primary sources in their original languages. Safi has taught at a number of universities and is currently teaching at Duke. He's written a number of books on Islam and Islamic studies, including Memories of Muhammad, Why the Prophet Matters. Like Lings, Safi is an extremely credible source. The last example I'll give at the moment is Alfred Guillaume, who lived from 1888 to 1965. Guillaume was a British Arabist and scholar of Semitic languages. He was a professor of Arabic at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London and also at Princeton. Guillaume is well known for his translation of the earliest Arabic biography of Muhammad, Ibn Ishaq Sirat Rasulullah. We'll be looking closely at Guillaume's translation throughout this course. Like Martin Lings and Omid Safi, Guillaume's training, background, and expertise make him a credible source. Now that we've looked at different types of sources and how to assess their credibility, what about finding and accessing the sources? There are a lot of options available. You can always purchase books online through Amazon or another online company, or you can buy them in person at your local bookstore. You can purchase journal articles from an organization such as JSTOR.org or directly from the publishers of the journals in which they appear. But unless you want to add a specific work to your personal library for some reason, you're going to want to borrow your sources. Your local public library is a great resource for borrowing books and accessing electronic journal databases. If you're affiliated with a college or university, that library's resources will also be available to you. Many colleges and universities also allow local community members to borrow books and to access journal databases. Signing up for a free account at JSTOR.org will allow you to access a certain number of journal articles per month. Prior to the pandemic, JSTOR allowed access to 6 articles per month, and since the pandemic, JSTOR has increased that to 100 articles a month. For electronic access to the sources we've discussed in this lesson, you'll need to sign up for a free account at archive.org, and then you'll be able to borrow those sources. Google Scholar is also an option for accessing sources, but it's not as robust as archive.org or JSTOR.org. Now that you have your secondary sources, how do you find and check the information in them? This is the purpose of footnotes and endnotes. Let's take a look at a couple of examples from the works we've been talking about so far. Near the end of Muhammad, his life based on the earliest sources, in between Ling's note on the pronunciation of Arabic names and the index, you'll find a reference key to the abbreviations he uses in his footnotes. Here, Lings tells us exactly which Arabic editions he used in writing Muhammad, his life based on the earliest sources. In the introduction to his translation of Ibn Ishaq's Sirat Rasulullah, Alfred Guillaume tells us which Arabic editions he uses, and we see that he uses primarily the same edition used by Lings. Lings devotes 2 chapters of Muhammad, his life based on the earliest sources, to Muhammad's early childhood. On page 25, we find the story of Muhammad's foster mother, Halima. You'll see a superscript number 1 at the end of the second paragraph. If you look at the bottom of the page, you'll see the footnote number 1 that corresponds to this. Lings cites II 105. II, as we learned in the reference key, stands for Ibn Ishaq's Sirat Rasulullah, and 105 is the page number in the Sirah where this story is found. But Lings is using the Arabic edition. So how do we find the story to which Lings is referring in Guillaume's translation of the primary source? Looking at the table of contents of the English translation of Ibn Ishaq, we find a section entitled His Birth and Foster Mother that starts on page 69 and ends on page 73. Turning to the translation of the story of Muhammad's mother and foster mother, we find on page 71 the number 105 in the outside margin. This shows that the story to which Lings refers is the story which Guillaume has translated. The story appears on page 105 in the Arabic edition used by both Lings and Guillaume. In Memories of Muhammad, Why the Prophet Matters, Omid Safi uses endnotes rather than footnotes. For example, on page 80, he tells the story of young Muhammad accompanying his uncle on a business trip to Syria. On this trip, they encountered a learned Christian monk by the name of Bahira. Bahira recognized the signs of prophethood on the young boy and warned his uncle to protect him from enemies who would threaten his life. At the end of the paragraph, we see the superscript number 20. There is no corresponding note at the bottom of the page, so that means there will be endnotes. Endnotes, as the name indicates, appear at the end of a work. A book's table of contents will tell you where the endnotes begin. Safi has organized his endnotes by chapter, and we find the notes for chapter 1 beginning on page 318. We find note number 20 on page 319, and note number 20 tells us that Safi has taken the story from pages 79 through 81 of Ibn Ishaq's Life of Muhammad. This tells us that he's using the English translation of the work. Turning to page 79 of Ibn Ishaq's Life of Muhammad, we find the beginning of the story of Bahira, which we can read to compare the details of the original telling with Safi's retelling in Memories of Muhammad. Let's recap what we've covered in this lesson. First, there are three kinds of sources. Primary sources that are usually based on first-hand knowledge. We'll discuss more about primary sources in upcoming lessons. Secondary sources that rely on primary sources, and tertiary sources that rely on secondary sources. Credible sources will have background, training, and expertise in the subject matter. Footnotes and endnotes will tell you exactly where your sources found the information they're citing. If your source is using abbreviations, they'll include some sort of reference key. Bibliographies and reference lists will give you detailed information about the specific editions of sources that your sources have used. This reference list contains the detailed bibliographic information for the works that we've discussed in this video. You'll find links to these works in the description below. Thanks for watching. If you found this video interesting and helpful, please like and subscribe.